Hello and welcome to this second section on web page text in our course on Adobe Dreamweaver CS6. Now in this section we're going to do a couple more things with text, and we're going to start to look at ways of formatting and presenting text. Now before we do that, I should point out to you that in terms of producing a really overall professional look and feel to websites, we're going to need to go into HTML, CSS and one or two other things in quite a bit of detail, which we'll be doing later in the course. In this section what I'm really going to do is to give you a flavour of these, to give you some idea of how they work and how they work together, and with that you should be able to really make a good start on making your website look good. So let's get started. Now we're going to start by looking at some basic formatting of text itself. Now there are really two categories that we start with. One of them is the formatting of text, and the other one we refer to as the formatting of paragraphs. So it's text we start with. And just to remind you of something we saw briefly earlier on, if I select, say, a point in this paragraph, the one that begins "Our Park," and look at the properties panel at the bottom, I see that the format is paragraph. Another thing to remind you is that what's selected on the left here is the HTML button. So we're looking at HTML formatting at the moment. Now if I select one of the words in there and say, let's say the word many is the word that I select, I can format that using various controls in the properties panel. So for instance, there is a bold button. Click on that, just click away, and I can see that word is bold. And in its simplest form, that's a very straightforward way of formatting text on a page. Another option here is the italic button. If I've got this heading, which is actually an heading 3 level heading, click on italic, it becomes italic. Now there's a very important point here. If I click inside the word many again, the format is still paragraph. The bold button is depressed, but the format is still paragraph. The original format of this sentence, the size of the characters, the font that's used, just about everything about it, is embedded in the definition of what a paragraph is on this web page, in this website. When I clicked bold with a specific word selected, I only made that word bold. I didn't change the definition of what a paragraph is on my website. I made a point specific change related to one word. Now similarly, if you look at our stars, that's an H3. Remember, it'll have an H3 tag. New arrivals has an H3 tag as well. They're both subject to the same format here. The difference is that I've applied an additional format, in this case italic, to one of those headings and made it a bit of a non-standard heading really. If I were to select it and say I want to make it paragraph instead of heading 3, let's put paragraph on there. Note that the italic part, the specific italic part that I applied, has been kept. Now let's put that back to heading 3 again, and that is the difference between definitions of text formatting which are part of the tags, the HTML tag definitions that we're applying to the elements on the page, and point specific changes that we choose to make. Now one of the most important aspects of designing, formatting the pages of your website is to try to get the balance right. Where you want a specific type of formatting, in a general case all of a certain type of paragraph, all of a certain type of heading, you really need to change the definition of that heading. Whereas if you want to make a point change, you maybe just want to make one word bold or highlight one particular feature, that's probably a case for applying a specific change, a specific piece of formatting at that point. Now let's look at this in a different way. If I select a point in this sentence, we have many great attractions. Let's choose something between the W and the E of we. And by the way, there's something here I probably ought to have told you about before, because it can be really irritating, this. That little ship's wheel thing that turns up, if I hover over it, it's called the Code Navigator Indicator. If you are using the Code Navigator, and I'll tell you about the Code Navigator later, that's a really useful thing. If you're not, and we're sort of not at the moment, it can be really irritating because wherever you're working this thing appears and goes over the top of what you're looking at. You can easily disable it. If you go onto the View menu and go down to Code Navigator, brings up this little box, which is actually used to locate the point you are in the code and enable you to leap in and start to work on the code. You can disable the indicator, at least temporarily, by checking on this checkbox and then just clicking outside. If I now click somewhere, that annoying little Code Navigator ship's wheel doesn't appear. Anyway, back to this particular sentence. Let's put it there. Look at the status bar here. We can see the nested HTML tags. P is the last one, beginning of the paragraph. Watch what happens now if I click inside the word many. I've now got an additional HTML tag. This one is a strong tag, which basically indicates bold. Now, if I look in the code view, let's go into split view in fact, I can see that I've got P there, which is the P tag at the start of the paragraph. Then I have strong, which basically says switch on bold. I have the word many. Then I have slash strong, which is basically switch off bold. And then it goes way down there to the end of the paragraph. And then I have the slash P HTML tag at the end of the paragraph. So strong is a specific, if you like, point tag, just applying to that one word that the tags surround to say make this one word bold. And that's also a very important concept within the HTML markup of a web page. Now, some of the other options on the HTML part of the properties panel we'll be looking at, CSS one as well, we'll be looking at most of those later on, but let's just stick with the basics for the moment. Let's look at this paragraph, our marine exhibits, because so far we've concentrated on text formatting. We made some text bold, some text italic. We can also make a whole paragraph behave in a different way. One of the most obvious changes we can make is to change the justification of the paragraph. So, for instance, I've got a heading there, attractions. All of the paragraphs on this page are left align. It is because the definitions of the styles, the HTML styles that are being used, involve left alignment, which is the default. If I wanted to make, say, attractions centered, it's quite simple. Just put the cursor somewhere within the paragraph, and then on the Format tab, click on Align and select Center. And that particular paragraph is now centered. If I add some text, as I add the text, it keeps centered. So let me go back to that original sentence again, and just to emphasize the point, in the case of text formatting, we select the text and then apply the text formatting such as bold or italic or underline. In the case of paragraph formatting, we only need to put the cursor somewhere in the paragraph, and the formatting operation such as left align, center align, right align is automatically applied to the whole paragraph. So with the cursor anywhere in the original sentence, our marine, if I click on Format, Align and then say Right, it right aligns that whole paragraph. Now, as we're on the subject of the basics of entering and formatting text, I've got a couple of very specific important points to make to you, because you're going to find these potentially more annoying things if you don't know how to deal with them. If I say I'm working on a sentence like this one, our park is a great location for a family day out. If I get to the end of that and press the Enter key, I start a new paragraph and it leaves quite a big gap. Let's type something else. And again There. Let's look at the code that's generated when I do that. Let's look in Split, and you can see that what happens here is that we get a lot of paragraph markers. It's down here, you can see. So we've got join us today, paragraph, empty paragraph there. That's one of the reasons that we get big spaces, is because each paragraph marker, each new paragraph, puts in quite a lot of line spacing. Now it's possible to end paragraphs in a different way that gives less space between the paragraphs. Let's go back into Design View. Let me go again to the end of Join Us Today, and instead of hitting the Enter key here, I'm going to hit Shift and Enter. Watch what happens. The cursor moves down to just immediately below the text that I've just typed. Again, carry on. And you can see there is no big space between the two paragraphs. Let's have a look at the code for that. What happens is you get a different sort of marker. You get a marker that's referred to as a line break in HTML language. And it's this tag with a BR and a slash at the end of it. So if at the end of something that starts with a P marker, so start of paragraph, join us today, I then have BR slash, I only have a line break in the paragraph. In fact, the text that's there is judged as being within the paragraph. You've just started a new line in the paragraph, and therefore I haven't had the big gap between two paragraphs. So I get join us today, line break, it's a great place to visit, line break, and then I get the end of paragraph character. So if you need to close your text up, use those line breaks, which you achieve with Shift and Enter. Now I should point out to you that although we're spending quite a bit of time looking at HTML tags, and I'm explaining to you what some of the most fundamental HTML tags do, once you get used to these and you get to know some of these tricks, you won't spend so much time looking at HTML tags that you forget what you're trying to do with your site, or at least that should be the case. But now I've got one other thing to show you which you'll also find very useful, and that is we're going to see how to put horizontal rules onto a page. Now these can be used for all sorts of different reasons, and in fact to a large extent when we come to look at tables and CSS and so on later on, we'll find alternative ways of doing this. But in the early stages it's a good idea to see how to do this, because it will illustrate one or two other useful things about CS6. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to center the heading that says Welcome to Springs Park. So go there, click on Format, Align and Center, and then with the cursor at the beginning of the text, effectively the beginning of that paragraph, Welcome, I go to the Insert menu, HTML, Horizontal Rule. Watch what happens. What I get is a horizontal rule right across the top of the page. Now when the rule is in place, it is automatically, when I first insert it that is, it is automatically selected. And when it's selected, first of all you can see it's selected because its HTML tag HR is here, and secondly you can see horizontal rule, it says there, which just emphasizes the fact that I've got a horizontal rule selected. And it gets default values for its width and height. Its alignment takes the default, and shading is currently enabled. It's currently checked on it. Now let's look at the things that we can do using the properties panel on this horizontal rule. For instance, supposing I wanted to change the height of this rule. Let's just try a different number at random. Let's see what happens if I put 10 in there. Now, apart from typing 10, I can just then hit the Enter key, and I can see I've got a much thicker rule. For the width, it's inherited the width of this part of the page, so it's within the content tag. Note the content tag begins there and the rule is within it. Let's try a different width. What about trying 100? Press Enter, and I get a much smaller rule. Now note that 100 is a width of 100 pixels. There are the units here that I choose, pixels. I could set the width in percent of the available space. So if I change that to percent, 100% is the whole width. I could make it 50, press enter, and it occupies half of the width. Now we've seen quite a few new things in the last couple of sections about entering and formatting text. I'm going to do one other section now covering the entry of text and formatting, and I'm going to use some of the things that we've learnt so far to make my pages look much more respectable, and I suggest you pretty much follow along and do the same with the site that you're working on. I'm going to start by tidying up some of the information that I've already got. Then I'm going to put in a couple more links, I'm going to put a footer on my pages, and I'm going to see how my site now looks before I start putting some images in. So join me for that in the next section.